Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Waracle webinar. So delighted you can join us. There's a good number of you on here today. So thank you so much for your time. What we're going to be discussing today is quite a broad topic, but actually, we'll jump about in a few different areas around digital strategy and financial services. And you won't be surprised to know that Waracle thinks that digital strategy is paramount to success in business, no matter what sector you're in. And if 2020 and 2021 has taught us nothing, is that there is such an increased reliance on this technology, and obviously from our perspective, particularly on phones. So today we're absolutely delighted to be able to be hosting a discussion between Derek Smith of Virgin Money and Chris Williams of Waracle. So just a very quick background, the guys will probably give you more detail, but Derek's head of digital solutions within Virgin Money and leads the teams that are creating digital products across customers and staff from the mobile and web channel point of view. And then Chris, from Waracle point of view, is probably at least 20 years experience, I don't know, Chris, with regards to working with enterprises of adapting their digital strategies, bringing in emerging technology, and undertaking larger digital transformation. So I won't go into more detail. I'll hand it over to the guys in a minute. Just quickly though, you can ask questions. What we will do is this will be a discussion in the main for most of this, but please send in questions that I'll be looking for in the Q&A button down the middle of your screen. And probably later on into the discussion, I'll try and interrupt the guys and get a word in edgewise to be able to ask some of these questions if you want to put any of them forward. So without holding up any longer, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you. If you can just give us a bit of an intro and what we're going to discuss today.
Sharon, thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Williams, as Sharon said, and I have spent the last 20 years in technology, specifically around mobile, helping enterprises and organisations adopt and leverage digital technology to ultimately transform. Absolute pleasure to be hosting the roundtable today, where we're going to be talking a lot about digital strategy, specifically within the financial services sector. And we've got a few themes that we're going to be talking through in and around strategy, ecosystem. So I'm really excited to kick this off and get the conversation going with your very good self, Derek. But perhaps you'd like to give us a quick intro of yourself first before you and I start to chat away.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris, and nice to kind of virtually meet everyone. So yes, as can introduce, I head up Virgin Money's digital solutions teams. That is looking kind of end-to-end how we design, build and maintain digital products across all customer and web channels, across all parts of banks, so retail and business. My kind of career has been split roughly in three different parts between product design or product sales and engineering. I started as a software kind of development degree in Dundee and then moved through different parts of FS, from big investment banks to fintechs to kind of commercial banks, and took up the role in Virgin a year ago. And the kind of key thing is how do we transform our methods in engineering, but also have accountability for how do we embed agile practices across the group. And that's where my kind of responsibilities cut across product design and engineering, and really that end-to-end digital strategy. So kind of keen and looking forward to being part of the discussion.
Well, as I say, it's a pleasure to be involved in this, and thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to us about it, because I think given that background and your experience and the topics that we've got to talk about, there's going to be some real nuggets of information here for people watching and listening, and we can have a bit of a Q&A a bit later on. But let's get stuck straight into this, because we're talking about digital strategy, which is sort of the first theme today, is to talk about the role that mobile plays specifically in financial services. And strategy to me has always been about discerning and defining where to play, how to win, and of course, given the world for which we now exist, digital is such a key enabler in all of that. But I want to sort of hone in on the mobile side, if I may, initially to talk around, because whilst tactically mobile, from an investment standpoint, the return isn't always felt straight away. Strategically, it's playing a vital role in where financial services businesses play, and the battle to win, retain, service customers is being played out across digital channels, but at the heart of it sits mobile. So I kind of wanted to open up the conversation really with a question of sort of, well, what role is mobile playing in your digital strategy right now?
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I do is kind of agree. I think mobiles, obviously, and I think everyone would say this, I would think, is fundamental in our current and future customer engagement strategy. If we look at our engagement with customers, 90%, if you're a retail banking customer of Virgin Money, over 90% of interactions are all via mobile now, not hybrid journeys, end-to-end mobile. So I personally don't actually find it hard to justify investment in mobile, but I think it's usually it's best not to justify the investment for mobile, it's best to justify the investment through the business strategy, engagement strategy, and then how does technology enable that? So the way I'd kind of look at that is taking those steps to say, mobile is definitely at the heart of how we want to interact with customers and where we want to make improvements. But it's looking at that top of the bank kind of strategy. So what is our future bank and customer vision? Where do we think we have USPs and how we can grow and maintain our market share? For that, you kind of then look at different levels. Do you want to be a vertical balance sheet? So where you're a kind of a bank or a company, you're selling products that are all of your own balance sheet. Do you want to be an ecosystem player, whether that's an intelligence-driven current account that links out to a marketplace for players, like say, if you're making a savings account in Monzo, it'll prompt you from your current account, but the actual where you will save will likely be with OpenNorth and another couple of players, versus a Starling that's a bit more of a wider marketplace and very much very business enabled. And how do you want to play there? And the other couple of options we look at is, do you want to be banking as a service? So things like Marcus and Goldman Sachs, where you're embedding finance into existing big consumer distribution networks like Amazon, Apple, etc. And then the fourth one, would be that embedded finance player. Where do you want to attack different parts of the marketplace and value chain with specific pieces of technology or finance proposition that may never see the customer from as a brand? Now, obviously, as a kind of retail bank and a business bank, which is primarily what we are, we're definitely more in that kind of balance sheet and ecosystem play. What we're developing, though, is instead of being something that kind of builds a suite of products that are all linked to finance, we very much want to link in the power of the Virgin brand and the different Virgin products and companies and how we bring that to customer to create a more engaging, reward-linked experience that can be about experience outside of finance, but bring a different type of relationship. And that's what we've seen in the last 6 months, where there's been prompts on free wine deals, Virgin Media. This month, it's about if you sign up to account, donating X amount through Virgin Money Giving. So again, that's the biggest non-for-profit giving site in the UK. And we've got those linked. Now, all of that links through mobile, all of that engagement, prompting, execution, sales journey is there. The kind of nuance, I would say, is that still, if you look from a business banking perspective, because lots of people use their business banking, it could be someone in any part of the company, often that is more of a hybrid and web field journey. And it's still 50-50 for us in terms of the customer engagement. So we need to look at that, saying, right, as we grow, because we put significant investment in growing both sides of the bank, we brought Chrysler and Virgin together, where does mobile play, where's our mobile architecture play? But the key thing for me is that doing that top-down view first, and then choosing how does mobile optimize those customer journeys, and then how do you evolve your architecture to support that? And that's something we're going to do with a lot of the guys in Waracle, so including Mike Wharton and co, to look at that. How do we optimize that reuse versus autonomy in the squads and teams that we have developing those journeys to really fuel mobile across our strategy?
I mean, there's so much there, and it's really, really interesting. I was taking some notes as you're going through that. And the first sort of big thing that kind of stood out, and it wasn't surprising to me, but what does surprise me is that how sometimes enterprises don't look at those analytics of understanding the end-to-end customer journey. You mentioned 90% there. That's clearly a massive driver in sort of determining, the strategy moving forward and that role that mobile plays in it.
Yeah. So sorry, what's the question on that, Chris?
No, it was really just a point of, I can imagine there's a lot of enterprises out there who perhaps maybe underestimate the importance of looking at that data intelligence to tell them, look, that complete end-to-end journey, how much of it is mobile enabled, especially in that consumer piece. Really, it was just a comment more than anything.
So yeah, it does,
so
definitely be, and I think that's where kind of trying to bring different parts of that product design and engineering and how you integrate that together is really critical. And especially then looking at, because lots of our design colleagues have really great approaches to customer insight, to journey design, to service design, and how you bring that so that if you're doing kind of discovery, design, delivery phases, or dual track discovery and delivery, how you get those teams optimally sharing and collaborating to bring that research and insight, but also then how you bring that engineering experience for options for how you solve or enhance the customer experience. So I think there's a piece definitely on the kind of journey metrics, but then there's also then how do you iteratively bring in what delights and annoys customers, and how do you take both of those into account as you're designing?
Yeah, something else you mentioned there was ecosystems. I think it's really interesting to talk about that because, you know, unlocking opportunities inside of companies now really does come to often looking outside the traditional ecosystem. So ecosystems, if we think about traditional financial services business, we've seen the likes, and you mentioned them, of Revolut, Monzo, Starling, who effectively they've built products, traditional banking services products, but they're actually servicing outside of the core sort of ecosystem. But at the heart of that, again, in the strategy is mobile, sort of connecting those customers with those complementary sort of products and services, and that sort of fueling that fintech revolution really. But why is that such an important strategic step, do you think, to look outside of this sort of traditional ecosystem?
Yes, I think there's kind of two elements for me. There's one on the rise and power of consumer applications. And I know this isn't new, but the amount of time they spend on Spotify, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, versus how much you spend on a financial services application. And so there's different ways of how we spend our time, spend our money, and have a brand recognition. So if you look at testing people's brand recognition of Facebook, Netflix versus the bank, there's definitely one way that will be, and especially on engagement and service. Similarly, if you test how many people know a meerkat or a large opera singer, that also resonates higher. So there's how we spend our time and where we engage brands for different services. There's then how different companies have tried to disrupt value chains in financial services and engagement. So if we look at the biggest companies had investment in Europe in fintechs last year, it was B2B players, right? Over £2 billion more invested in B2B than B2C last year. What does that mean? That means obviously there's different elements that are disrupting these areas of that value chain. And then as a kind of financial services player, you need to decide, okay, how do I optimally want to play? Where do we think we can win and exceed for customers in that market where you've got different consumer lifestyle and engagement with products, and on the other side you've got different challenges at different parts of that value chain. So that's where I think we kind of spoke before around, yes, you look at something like Marcus with Amazon and Apple, right? So that's one way of Amazon, obviously one of the biggest engagement for people globally. Actually, they do really want to play as an FS player. They've tested it a couple of times and pulled back, so it's not to say they won't. Similarly with Apple, actually Apple's credit card book is fully underwritten by Marcus from Goldman Sachs. That's allowed Goldman Sachs to basically reduce from doing a lot of D2C credit cards, but it's given them the biggest book. They've got a full consumer profile from Apple to help them price it straight away. So it's knowing that piece of how do you create componentized propositions that allow you to directly discuss to reach customers wherever they are living and at that right life moment. Because the life moment will often not be them coming to do something in your app. It'll likely be how can you engage with them using open data, different distribution systems. I think that's why it's important. People kind of live and engage differently, and that evolves, and you need to be able to build componentized services that can reach into different touch points through that.
Is again a really interesting sort of area is this whole ecosystem piece. If somebody that's you guys are clearly looking at this in great detail and looking at sort of how you can leverage information, how important is the role of data in making those strategic decisions in all of this, is the first question, and how do you go about leveraging and using that data?
Yeah, so I think significant, and I know that's an easy answer, are critical, but I think what I'd look back is, again, 10, 15 years ago, definitely pre-open banking, then the banks had a significant advantage where they were a custodian of data that was not easily shareable and not mandatorily shareable. That's changing. I know there aren't many propositions winning in the market on that yet. Again, there's been good layer-based technology that allows to aggregate, so things like buds and stuff, very, very good, TrueLayer, etc. But not many leading customer propositions yet. We've been no money dashboard and stuff. Never like the company, but would you say they're leading yet? Potentially not. So I think that's where we would look to play, of putting a real importance on how you can access data across an ecosystem, not just the data you hold. And that's where we can invest early in open banking, working with different fintech partners in Scotland to build that. So that's an option where, as we look at new propositions, so for example, where we're working with Waracle on new business banking propositions and marketplaces and wellness trackers that look at the ongoing health of a business from the start in our enterprise architecture and system design, it has open finance data at the heart from day one. Now, I think in the past it would have been a secondary thought, or it would have been make sure we can have an API out to that, but not at the heart of the data and analytics strategy. We're trying to make that now. So I think that's where we need to look and see that. Now, that might mean that in stage one in MVP, you're testing out some of your kind of own data that you can aggregate and mask quickly, but you need to really be designing for some of that from day one. Because I can only see open finance data being more easily available over time. So I think that's where you need to play. And that's how we will try to do that from day one. Because again, people may have seen, we've been announcing kind of every month a new fintech that we're bringing into that marketplace. And that's, we're looking at, yes, how do we mask and give them sample data in a sandbox to allow them to iterate and test their proposition with us. But equally, how do we scale that as an enterprise?
And you mentioned earlier about the sort of, there's obviously the consumer element of banking versus the business side of it, and that 2 billion extra that was being spent in business. Do you see a particular opportunity in, or a bigger opportunity in either of those markets, or are they sort of an equal, opportunity play at the moment?
So I think at the moment, if you're, and this is a generalism, but I think if you're starting a fintech and you've got really strong technology, I think at least having a BTD offering is critical. So if you look at, say, 5 to 10 years ago, many fintechs were coming in and saying, okay, we will disrupt by going B2C and we'll take big players out. But in many financial service offerings, that's hard because you don't have the capital to sustain it in downturns. So if you can start with having a B2B option from the start, it allows you to have scale, it allows you to have a kind of your own disruptive opportunity that you can have different value chains and different financial revenue streams. So I definitely think having an option for how you use B2B is critical, because it's very few companies that will create a full D2C value chain and win in that space. Now, it's not to say others there will be, but if you can have that option of B2B, then it allows you to scale in different ways and play in different parts of the value chain. And especially for startups where often you don't know where you're going to win from day one and you often pivot. So if you think of that componentization and embedding in different parts of the value chain from day one, I think it gives you that kind of hedged bet on how you grow.
It's interesting as you talk through some of these things, a lot of it is not necessarily trial and error, but testing. You mentioned MVPs, and it makes me think about, again, as the topic and the themes that we've got around this is sort of digital strategy. But strategically, how important is it to adapt ways of working when deploying and developing digital products, be it in mobile or across the digital spectrum? Because to me, it seems almost abundantly obvious that when we, especially listening to you talk about, the importance of MVPs and the types of cyclical approach that's being taken, ways of working must be playing a huge part of that transformation. Yeah,
significantly. So I think for us, we've quite a significant change in our operating model in the last 6 months. So we had lots of elements of Agile embedded in how we build product, but mainly within a team rather than how we collaborate end to end. So we've kind of pivoted our structure for changing about 600 to 700 people's ways of working. And it firmly is some of the pieces I said at the start of how do you collaborate with product design and engineering end to end? How do you pivot to kind of product and customer-led, customer journey team? So we've moved that end to end to try and say for each feature team or squad, depending on which kind of terminology you use, they need to own part of a journey end to end. Now, we're evolving towards that. It'll take time, but I think it's kind of critical for that. But yes, for test and learn, but also to bring different mindsets together. I think we've definitely had to shift some of our thinking there and are still doing it. So we're in forming stage of changing this model for how you bring those different mindsets of the customer, of the design, P&L, of engineering capability together to think through problems as they evolve and opportunities. So yeah, we're trying to completely change our operating model towards that. And then to your point, again, we're investing quite a lot in how we independently and parallel release. Now, I know lots of people try to do that, so it's not like oh, this is different. But I think, how can we have 30 plus squads deploying independently every 2 weeks in a safe way, but also then it ties back up to the strategy to still have the same North Star that we're heading towards. And they're the kind of things we're doing, changing ways of working, changing technology and architecture so they can complement each other to allow that fast and iterative increase in your kind of digital estate.
Again, part of that strategic piece in relation to the ways of working, you mentioned about the operating model and the structure and agile being a major part of that. You know, how important is it? I mean, you know, working with third parties and that collaboration, because that was a phrase that you used earlier in the conversation. How important is that, particularly when you're sort of laying out that digital strategy and saying, well, look, we've kind of worked out the North Star. We know where we're going to go. We've got to change our ways of working. And that's not a small task given the size of an organization, you know, especially in the banking sector with all the regulations that sit around it. But, you know, how important, with all of that in mind, has it been to sort of take a collaborative approach, bringing in, you know, working with third parties, especially in and around the digital, you know, product development?
So I think it is significant. It is very, very important, but also how you do it. So I think that piece of trying to take badges off at the door, trying to say whether it's a partner, permanent colleague, contractor, how you create a team effect, but really mean it and really follow through on that. So, for example, what we've been doing with some of the like Scrum Masters that we have from Waracle, how do we work together to create guilds across the Scrum Master community in different disciplines to say, okay, here's how we think we should operate and roll out ways of working. How have we seen that at different clients from partners? How have we worked on it internally? And try and have a single voice for how we approach that. It's not a one size fits all, but it's sharing that best practice and trying to have a badges off at the door approach. I think that's what we're trying to do. And again, yeah, it's trying to not have that, oh, you're a contractor, you're a partner. I think it's changing that to try and say, okay, we're trying to solve the same problems. How do we form a single team to do that?
Yeah, brilliant. So we've touched on the initial, you know, strategic piece around mobile and tactically how important that is. We've talked a little bit around the ecosystem piece and stretching outside of that and how that plays a role. But one of the areas I wanted to touch on and have a conversation around was the FX sector has often relied on the aggregator market for some products. And as digital transformation ultimately challenges the status quo, FS is starting to embrace a more integrated channel approach from what I've seen, but again, with mobile at the heart of it. And the opportunity this offers is for potentially to, again, push ecosystems further, cross-selling services, which we mentioned earlier. Now, this type of strategic digital approach has, again, been sort of done by the fintechs initially, but what are your experiences of that in terms of that aggregator model and that type of strategic approach and the opportunities potentially that could bring in disrupting that?
Simon, I would hope again that offers an opportunity for greater saving overall for consumers. So again, when I talked about some of those aggregators, big banks, so people who want to be in the top 10 of the page of products that you see on that will typically be paying 7 to 8 figure sums per year to be on that aggregator. I don't think consumers always realise the embedded costs of that as part of the product they're buying. Right? So is there a way that you can have a thinner layer, modern push notification, embedded financial service offering in consumer products that allow you to get a lower cost, but also, as I said, that it allows you to kind of get more of those, get the products at the right life moment for you, rather than dumb notifications in an app, whatever it may be. Where I've kind of seen kind of strong offerings for that, if you look at kind of Sage, Xero, and some of the big accountancy packages, there's some of the kind of tech players and the payments and the credit fintechs are really embedding in there that allows accountants to manage a suite of customers, batch payments, payrolls, etc. for them, embedded in those accounting packages, and it doesn't need to touch a bank. They've got licenses from the bank. They've got licenses from the Bank of England to operate there. So that's kind of maturing. That really is disrupting value chains. It's maybe not a kind of sexy consumer thing that you see, but it's transforming the cost to do that for businesses, the speed to get payments done. And I think that's where you kind of start to see those offerings. Now, what I think we need to then think through is how can that affect consumer offerings? So it's simple to say that our Apple bills, our kind of Google bills are things that we're kind of used to now all the time, but how can we use some of the engagements of those layers to position products at the right time? And that goes back to your earlier point of, and those companies probably have better data on us than any other company. So how can you do that for value to consumer, not just for trying to spray gun them or do things that don't have consent?
You mentioned about the cost for consumers being, driven down ultimately, and you mentioned also the phrase there, it's not a particularly sexy area to necessarily look at, but how important is it for financial services company across the spectrum from banking through to investment management, everything? How important is it, do you feel, for organisations to get creative and really be thinking deeply about that consumer experience, not just from the experience standpoint of their digital interactions, but actually improving the products? Because when we talk about that particular point, it seems obvious to me that in having some creative thinking around that sort of, how do we not rely so much on these aggregator models? How can we make reduce the cost for customer, which ultimately means that we can deliver better products and services, we can invest more in digital infrastructure. All of these things are really important, but in my view, but I'm interested to hear your view, and it is the more that should be being done there creatively by organisations who perhaps, especially in the FS space, who perhaps are not necessarily looking at that as close as maybe they should.
Yeah, and I think that piece of also, so this is a kind of personal view, I think also if you work in financial services, you typically think it is more important to people than they think, right? And I don't mean that it's not critical to manage their money. I mean, in their day-to-day lives, how often do they actually care about it, right? And actually, it's kind of often they want it to be managed, they want it to be simple, and they don't want to get done by the deal that they get. So I think that's where you need to see how can you interact and show value in a way that's seamless, quick for the consumer and add value. So things like that, where we've tried to embed things like a Go Compare API into our personal current account that can prompt the customer to say, here's how you can save on your energy. Do you want to see that saving? And that can be embedded in the analytics from the journey. I can choose to elect to run that savings comparison or jump into that journey. I don't go out of the app. It's a kind of embedded customer journey. So I think it's that piece of how do you use things that as your consumer is engaging, they have the opportunity to use it, using the insight you know, and then you, instead of where we've thought about before of having a single app, well, that might be the kind of single front door, but you definitely need to think about how you have hybrid mobile journeys that flip between React, Flutter, native, between your app, partner apps, JVs, and how you make those seamless to the consumer. So you can definitely use the data to identify the value, engage at the right time, engage in a way that tries to make it useful for the customer and not overbearing, and then seamless execution of that through hybrid journeys. I think that's probably ways to try to win.
Definitely. I guess finally it'd be great just to touch a little bit more on sort of sharing with the audience potentially, I'm thinking out loud just so how to approach some of the strategic plans really when looking at mobile specifically, given your experiences and your learnings, what are the sort of key things, or perhaps the top 2 or 3 I guess, takeaway nugget points that you would advise people that perhaps maybe are listening in and watching this about sort of mobile playing in their digital strategy, and how they should be approaching, particularly if they've not got potentially mobile applications yet, if they're not necessarily leveraging mobile technology within their ecosystem. What are the things, where should they be starting, do you think, given your experience?
So if you've not started, I think that piece that you could mention before, if it's not starting with I need an app, it's starting with how do customers or people in general engage at the moment digitally? So how do they engage with services through that part of their life? So whether it's a health product, financial services one, getting a view, getting some research, whether that's market research you do yourself or buy in, to understand how do customers interact as consumers, as users of product around that, and what is the digital engagement options of that. Then trying to look ahead. So I think one of the things we've looked at is said, if you just look in your own market or your own jurisdiction, you're probably going to miss some things in the future. So I think we've looked at things like WeBank in China. So went from nothing to second top bank in China within 3 to 5 years, over 1 billion users. Now, part of the reason is they come out with WeChat, Beidou, they've got a different kind of ecosystem to play in. But if you look at them, they built a bank completely different to anyone else in the world. Right? It's a tech company, and it also didn't build a website. It built distribution points through engagement channels, through Beidou, WeChat, and that's how they engage. And it's very API-led, an amazing kind of really interesting story. But equally, so that's one angle. Look at different markets, different jurisdictions around how people do engagement, where there's different views on that, to try and look ahead. So I think I often kind of, again, look to the left of me, that's one of my daughter's rooms, and she uses voice chat more than SMS, and almost every message is with her friends. Now, some of that sparked from how Snapchat works. And again, it's trying to look ahead at that, of not just how do you understand how consumers work, get different viewpoints on that, different markets, different jurisdictions, different areas, and look at leading engagement methods that probably aren't going to be just in FS or just in health, whatever market you're in, to look at that. So then get your research, get your journey design, get some disruptive thinking from other markets, and then get that early prototyping and wireframing and testing out with customers to see where does mobile sit within that, and then iterate.
It's really interesting, again, because listen to you talk through that. My own experiences as a consultant working with enterprise organisations, especially incumbent businesses, in a multitude of sectors, there often seems to be this quite insular approach to digital sometimes, in a sense that they don't necessarily look outside of their existing operation and their existing market sector. And one of the things you touched on heavily there was that perhaps maybe look outside of that and see what's happening and do that user research. And I often find that that's the critical success factor for the organizations that are transforming at pace, especially if we look what's happened in the last 18 months with, last 12 months with a global pandemic. The organizations that have continued and maintained pace have been the ones that have been able to effectively pivot, adjust, and be responsive to change. And when I look at sort of some of the incumbent sort of organisations that have often struggled with that, it is ultimately, because they've not necessarily looked outside. Notwithstanding that, there's an abundance of almost opportunity for incumbent organisations because they're sat on such large chunks of data that aren't necessarily being interrogated to inform them of the choices that they could be making in and around digital. I find it really interesting that to see and hear and listen to your own experiences about how you'd advise other people to do that would be to literally start with, well, how does the customer interact? But to look outside of that also as part of that journey, because don't just look at your own market sector, look at what's happening elsewhere, and because that's really where disruption starts to come from when we look at that value chain.
And I think even that it's again just trying to challenge your own thinking. So that blended customer research view, where yes, you do mass research, but even your customer labs types approach, where you can have mirrored walls and just hear customers of what do you think of our product? How do you experience it from a professional interviewer who isn't an expert in your product? It really just challenges that thinking. So again, I used to work, I did used to help lead a lab that looked at life insurance products. And when you hear from customers of saying, I think I've been done because the product's not paid out and I've had it for 20 years. Now, the purpose of the product is to protect you and your family if someone dies. But that's not coming across some users. So we needed to look at, okay, how do you either educate on the value of that product through the lifetime of it, or how do you shift it to something like a kind of vitality offering that has iterative value throughout the life cycle, but if that big event happens, you've also still got the main protection behind you. And again, whatever market you're in, having that kind of tangible feedback from customers that isn't doctored, and you're not trying to explain to them what your product does. I think I've always found that really critical and really useful.
Yeah, hugely. I mean, I know in Waracle we have a series of phases that we take customers through, and sort of the consultancy and discovery phases really are absolutely critical. And it's interesting that when we go through that with organizations, how they begin to realize that kind of approach and that way of thinking and looking at the customers and asking them and then getting that feedback and then passing that through, and how quickly we can do that and get into a prototype phase. Often I think it is quite surprising, but it's something that we found has been so important to help accelerate people's sort of transformation journeys, and really sort of leverage mobile and it play a key part in their strategy, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where, again, when you're looking at transforming the operating model and ways of working, it's about also influencing and educating different layers of the organisation to give people that freedom to do that. So the things like a kind of Marty Kagan inspired type strategy around how do you go to signature deliverables per quarter, not a fully itemised plan, to give people the freedom to solve different problems based on the customer interaction. And again, that's not something that I was saying we have 100% solved, but it's something we're kind of trying to face into.
Well, it's a massive transition, isn't it? I mean, that is a huge behavioural shift inside an organisation, and we don't need to hide it. It's not easy. Transformation is an uncomfortable thing. The reality is that it's necessary, and that type of switch in operating structure and framework is really mission critical to sort of remain relevant and surviving in the digital economy for which we now exist.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think. Well, I think we might sort of turn to some questions at this point. Is if there's any coming in, Sharon? If that'd be a good point.
Sure, no problem. I'm actually sitting watching people type them and expecting some of them to come in. But I've got a few questions of my own, and then I'll jump onto some of these. So, in my previous life, I worked within financial services, and funny enough, I worked for a National Australia Bank group, which used to be part connected to where Derek is now. So I'm interested in, I come from a distribution channel background as well. So I know some of the challenges for more traditional banks has been the layering of costs of the channels. So you've got your branch network, your ATMs, your call center, mobile, and so on. And so I'm interested in your views of what you've seen over the last year with regards to the pandemic. Have there been areas that you think have broken or been really stressed by the speed at which we had to go very digital and remote for most people? And then also, do you think it's helped the strategy in terms of particularly your focus on the mobile and web side of things?
So I think we're probably fortunate. So I joined the bank on the 1st of April, so 1 week into lockdown, which was fun. So interesting, I think I've met 3 people face to face, so that's been interesting. So as someone who quite likes kind of interaction, I'm kind of struggling with that a bit. But I think one of the good things group did is we kind of managed to get teams up at scale running to everyone in the group, or 80% of people in the group within a couple of weeks within lockdown, which really helped with interaction. I know that if people had been on conference calls lots, I think it would have been really tough to do that. So from a kind of colleague perspective, I think we did quite well at that. There was challenges in some devices and other things which still are a bit of an ongoing challenge, just with global supply of laptops at the first start. But we faced into that, and I think that's reasonably worked. I think that's worked really well, to be honest, as well. If we're thinking from a kind of customer perspective, areas that have been pressure, I think definitely we've had more, at different points, different demands on our contact centre, so in our telephony model than we would have had before. we've also looked at trialing where we place things like web chat. So web chat, chatbot technology, where is that on the site? Where does it drive different value for customers? And then how does that drive demand into the contact center as you're trying to iterate and grow kind of cognitive models versus human response? And that's definitely put pressure on, right? So I think it's put positive support for customers, but it's definitely put pressure on our contact centers and on our strategy for that. I think the good thing that's probably done is that's pushed further ahead our view on how we look at cognitive technologies across. So don't just plug a chatbot here, change your IVR technology and telephony there. What's your end-to-end intelligence layer that sits across that to optimize engagement? And again, as usual, it could be for a hybrid journey where you want to flip between a chatbot to a next best action and a cognitive to a call center operator, depending on what the customer needs are. I think that's definitely put pressures on, but it's accelerated how we look at that strategy. So we're spinning up kind of 3-4 squads around some of those things.
Okay, and so even then, you talk about that 90% of the transactions are going through mobile. What was it? Do you know what it was prior to you joining?
To be honest, I don't. So I could get that, but I'll be honest, I don't. I'd be making it up. So apologies.
Yeah. I mean, I'm imagining that there was a very big ramp up by a lot of people in terms of switching over and adopting the app, and which probably related a lot to what you're talking about of the contact center needing to help people through that.
And I guess the other challenge we have had is we were also going through an integration as lockdown started. So we were kind of midway through a migration between Clydesdale Bank and Virgin. So that caused us some challenges, which I think we managed well. I think some of the challenges we face into this year is lots of the things we were working on during the first couple of lockdowns was ideas and projects and product development that was in flight, whereas this year there's far more that's new, and I think that's a different challenge. So that's where we've been discussing with different partners we work with of how have you managed that, or how you faced into that, especially when we look at discovery, design. Doing that collaboratively, digitally and remote is definitely a challenge for people who are not used to it. We're not, right? So that's something that is an open challenge at the moment, but we're definitely facing into.
Yeah, we did quite a few webinars on that kind of way back at the beginning of all of this, because I guess for us, notwithstanding our size, but actually for us, it was perhaps an easier journey because it's kind of inherent into what we do in terms of turning that over. The difficulty and where we've really needed to work through and work out ways of working is exactly that, is the interaction with our clients like yourself or with new prospects or other partners is trying to make that work. So it's interesting. One of the other questions that's come in, and you can both have a go at it, in terms of with the reliance of technology increasing throughout COVID and causing more digital growth, what key trends do you expect to see post-COVID as we recover and finally get out of some kind of lockdown?
Do you want to go first, Chris?
I can do. I think it's a really good question, this actually, because I think in terms of trends, I think it's just going to continue. I don't see that anything's going to sort of slide back. And I think what we've seen is naturally this acceleration of digital technology. But even if we look at sort of the high streets and we look at businesses, very sadly, that have gone by the wayside during the pandemic, is that much of that, dare I say, rot was already embedded in what's happened is that the decline has just been accelerated, and I think what we're going to see more of is just the continued growth of digital adoption. And you know, when I think personally, I look at sort of financial services, I think and can see in through conversations is that how the trend is going to move really some sort of as we interact on and make big life decisions, whether that's mortgages and things like that, how our interactions that we are used to have in branch and so on and so forth, how all that's going to change. I think that's going to be a dramatic shift, and I think that's now going to accelerate. And I certainly think over the next few years we'll see the sort of, you know, branch networks changing significantly. I think that there's going to be, and again, behind all of that will be mobile, and I think that's probably the big trend for me in summary is going to be mobile continuing to fuel that growth, and the way our interactions, you know, will continue to adapt and change and be much more digitally driven. That's not to say that, you know, we won't have any sort of human interaction in branch, things like that. I just think the experience will all sit around mobile and digital.
Okay, Derek, do you want to have a stab?
Yeah, yes. I think it's a kind of similar thing. I think there's areas I'd looked at. So I'd say in the past when I was kind of in commercial banking, we would often, this experience I would have myself, drive 4 hours to a farm to speak to a customer about their European subsidy they were going to get, and explain to them kind of how they manage that risk, they want to manage the currency risk, etc. That probably isn't the best value add to someone driving 8 hours to do that. But and this isn't just picking on like a specific consumer group, but there are areas where people were less digitally engaged. I think one of the benefits of this is it has forced people to be more digitally engaged. So if you talk, I don't know, everyone talks to families, I would imagine that everyone knows what Zoom is now, and has probably been on a call and probably on a quiz, right? But they'll know how to use it. So I think hopefully some areas where you've got more basic digital skills have to step up, and that can hopefully also give opportunities for growth and interaction, but hopefully better service offerings. I think that's where banks and different tech companies need to think about that. How do they leverage that? So in the past, would they have used as much Zoom, Teams for interaction with customers? Probably not. Like I know areas that did do it, but it wasn't the scale across all of their offering. I think that will be far more embedded, and there will be far more people who probably want that than going in for a physical meeting. Now, it doesn't say you can't have it, but again, it's the suite of things you can use, and I think that offers opportunity.
Okay, I'm keeping up with reading and trying to listen to you at the same time. Now, one thing I'm kind of interested in is in terms of the streamlined nature or the ease of onboarding and bringing customers into that very early engagement and the first interaction they have with you. And I think what's interesting when we compare some of the new, not so new now, but the disruptors of the Monzos or the Revoluts or whoever, in terms of how the ease of that onboarding is. And I guess I'm kind of shoehorning a few things in here, the attractiveness to not only, but very much a younger generation. And I'm interested to see how that's driving some of your strategies in terms of how you're focusing on the ease of acquisition and that very first onboarding engagement as to how to make that more streamlined and more attractive relative to other players on the market.
Yeah, so it's definitely a focus. Like, there's no doubt about that. I think from a personal, sort of kind of retail perspective, I think that's undeniable, right? So I was in the queue, I remember when they were trying to drum up the first engagements for Monzo, so I've got multiple cards to kind of see how different people are playing. I think the ease of doing that, there's other areas like Metrobank when how their onboarding journey was a bit more face-to-face, but it was seconds or minutes rather than hours or days. I think it's definitely a focus for us. I think, again, how to use open data with proper consents to do that very quickly. What I would say is you need to do it right. So I don't know, I've recently remortgaged. There was a few people offering open finance data to do it, and it failed, and I did not go with that pace, even though it's cheapest. So I think there's, yes, using that data, but making sure your API connections, your connectivity is slick so that it executes. And then there's also that piece then post onboarding. What else would I do to learn? I think the power of how some of the newer players use consumer and customer groups to iterate and to communicate with the customers. So I think definitely learning from that. One of the things we would do is, far more frequent releases, but you need to be able to explain that to customers and take the journey and explain how you're responding to them. So it's not a surprise when something changes in their journey, and they see the value in contributing to how that happens. So I think that's two of the things I would look at kind of learning and growing from and adapting.
Okay, I'm getting bombarded with questions, but one of the questions I had was, I've been talking about the youth a little bit, but one of the interesting areas we're looking at the moment is across more around wealth management. And I know this doesn't necessarily purely touch on Virgin Money, but I know you've had some background, both of you have had background in this. And I'm interested in what seems to be an interesting issue here is that the intergenerational wealth side of things, of how to make sure that a family package, if you like, is brought into potentially the wealth discussion, and making sure that what has always worked for perhaps an older generation, which is more traditional, more face-to-face, not necessarily that it is now, but that is what they've been used to, versus a younger element within that same family group, and which seems to me is beginning to be focused on, but is also an area that is ripe for opportunity in terms of bringing people into that. So I don't know if you guys had any comments or thoughts on that.
Do you want to start or me, Chris? I don't mind. I've got ideas, but what would you like?
Go on, fire away. Go on, you go for it.
Yeah, so I think some of the places I've kind of worked before, then we've looked at some of that. I think I remember some of the research we looked at that said in 10 to 15 years, there will be 4 to 5 generations of families all within the workplace. Hopefully not the same workplace, I probably wouldn't enjoy that, but all working, right? And again, often our products pay out up the way. So you have had an accident, right? Something happens to you, so right? So I think there's definitely a gap in how you manage that, where often the financial dependency, especially in those longevity pieces, will be in the middle generation of that family as they are parents, and they may be supporting children, grandchildren, grandparents. So a suite of products that helps have a suite of benefits and protections, I think, is really could definitely be important. Definitely in different, look at different cultures as well, who I think would really embrace that. And we looked at it from a life insurance perspective of, could you have a group coverage that could pay out for care to support ongoing needs and potentially parents, could pay out for life or critical illness for yourself or your children. And I think there's definitely a gap there, and I think how you can do some of that joined up planning and support is definitely an opportunity.
Okay.
I've looked at tools like, again, a fintech I really like is a company called Envisage. So they bought out the advice platform for Morgan Stanley, and that's a platform that looks at end-to-end your life goals, your financial situation, your workplace, your life, your kind of health, and gives analytical views on, depending on the goals, and they could be support a child going to university, pay off your mortgage, whatever. There's a multitude of different scenarios. It gives you kind of options for how you engage with that. Now they're starting to offer that with a lot of different banks, but also consumer players, depending on what the goals are that the consumer sends. And I quite like that because it can play at any point in that generation need. So I think that's the type of offering that I definitely see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Chris, do you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting space because I think there is so much opportunity there. And if we think about some of the conversation that we've had earlier on today in and around sort of, understanding the, what's happening with your customers and the consumers and that intergenerational wealth piece, we've got a broad audience of people there, and consumers now want things on demand and they want things to be easy. And even though there's lots of potential options out there from a wealth management perspective, there isn't a lot of options when it comes to digital. And I think if we think about creating longevity in relationships with customers and the importance of that and maintaining customers and remaining relevant to them, there has to be this investment in technology. And I can just see there's so much opportunity there for somebody to start to take that lead in there. And and as Derek said, there are some fintechs that are there that are starting to sit in the middle of that and bring things together. But I think some of the more incumbent providers have got, they've got the data, they can start to analyze some of this, they can start to engage with those consumers and really build some transformational products. And I get quite passionate about some of this purely because I see so much opportunity amidst all the, the challenges that we've all faced during these tough times. What has happened during the pandemic is a real sort of sense of digital bringing people together and the opportunity that exists, especially in that sort of final third of late adopters with technology across a number of sectors. And I think wealth is a big one to play out.
So I think that's an interesting conversation because historically in banking, and again, I'll generalize, is loyalty has been way back is very much related to your bank manager and your branch and all of those kind of things. So now we're into a world of digital where you, if you're like me, you hope you never have to talk to someone and you can just do everything on the phone. So I'm interested to see what your thoughts are in terms of creating loyalty and longevity of customer relationships within that environment, and what's, I guess, what triggers you think have changed, and where we think we're heading now in terms of bank managers gone, branches gone. What's this dynamic here? Oh, neither of you want to take it.
No, I do. I've got loads to say, but I didn't want to steal too much airtime. But look, I think this is it's a really, really interesting area. And again, I'll use the phrase opportunity. But what we have to look at is that consumers now, of which we are all, we don't have a lot of time. We have lots of information available to us, and our attention spans are very small. So our expectation levels are incredibly high. And when you think about the amount of time we spend on these devices, on applications, and the most of that time is spent on applications which give us on-demand services, Amazon, Netflix, whatever it is that we want quickly. And so to win the hearts and minds of your consumer, whether that's dealing from a B2C level or a B2B level, you have to be playing strategically where to play, how to win. You have to be playing in this world well and right. And the only way to do that is by understanding the demands and configuring your organization to be responsive to change, having ways of working that enable you to deliver digital products effectively and quickly, and being responsive to the demands of those customers. Because if we take the generalization of the banking sector, yes, in 20 years ago when I first went into business and started to, in my working career, I was sat in front of a bank manager and we had those conversations, but that's gone now. That doesn't happen. The demand and the expectation is very different. And we only have to look at the sort of COVID financial packages that came into place from the UK government and how quickly banks have to turn those around. Which were the banks that did it that some of the most impressively were the ones that actually were sort of there on demand, quick applications and done. And I think that's a hugely important thing. I think for anybody either watching, listening to this now or in the future, is that investment in digital is absolutely mission critical, because that is where we are, but that's where the future is going to be.
And I think the thing I'd add is probably your point, Sharon, of where at other points in the past you would have had a bank manager that spoke to different points in your life, or a financial advisor. I don't think anyone's really tapped with how you build that ongoing relationship that doesn't feel pushed or generic. So you will often log on to an app and it might be the front tile is a dumb or reason attempt to be bespoke advertising. But how does that engage with you at the right moment in your life? Changes in salary, changes in job, changes in lifestyle, in a way that you don't feel is intrusive, you feel it's additive. And I think that's the way of, if you can make those engagements that interact for small needs and big needs, then you'll be able to create an ongoing relationship. You need to just be careful then, how do you build that brand value that the customer recognises that you are providing that service, if you want to have that DTC offering. And I think that's where, I don't think anyone's really tapped the piece you could talk about the intergenerational. That's an opportunity, right? Because you can talk, there's multitudes of points of where you can support that customer and that family through different points of their life. That's possibly a good way to get involved in that. I was away to mention some other fintechs, but I'll pause on that.
No, I genuinely think it's really interesting, and I mean, a lot of us have loyalty because it's just easier, and I guess there's a default loyalty in a way. Without going into another area, because we've only got 2 minutes left, but we often talk about pensions, and we've worked on a number of pensions apps, and what's interesting there is partly my age, but my engagement level since having an app has gone up tenfold, if not more than that, in terms of just being interested in seeing, and it's available, as opposed to a piece of paper that's sitting in my drawer and I don't understand. And so I think there's some interesting dynamics there in terms of how in the banking sector, financial sector, we supply information and make it readily consumable for our customers. And the app has absolutely done that, overnight for me in terms of the understandability of it.
So it's interesting, there's also the responsibility on the FS provider as well, because apps drive greater engagement in pensions But if you look at historical returns, the more often someone on a D2C changes their investments, it doesn't pay out, right? That's not top returns. So it's also how you do that in a responsible way that gives people information, but educates them on you probably don't want to be changing all the stocks in your portfolio every week, for example. So that's, I guess, how do you use valuable engagement, information, education, but also either advice or support on how that customer best manages that interaction.
Yeah, right. I'm going to stop us there. There are a number of other questions that we'll try and get back out to everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been interesting to everyone. Honestly, I can't thank Chris and Derek enough. I think it's been a really interesting conversation to listen to. And we may have to have you both back again to do round 2 to get into some of the other topics that we've talked about. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And I hope everyone that's come on has enjoyed and has taken something away from it. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.